So you know how they say you really don't know someone until you see them with their family? Well, I learned that lesson the hard way at what was supposed to be my engagement celebration dinner. Picture this. I'm sitting there thinking I'm about to become part of this loving family, and then my fiancé's uncle stands up to give a toast. Instead of welcoming me or saying something nice, he basically tells the whole table that I'm just a placeholder until someone better comes along. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was watching my fiancée sit there in complete silence while her entire family laughed. That moment changed everything, and what I discovered later that night made me realize I'd been living a lie for months. So I'm Marcus, 31M, software developer. I work at this mid-sized tech company downtown. Nothing too exciting, but it pays well, and I actually enjoy what I do. Been there about 4 years now, got my own little cubicle and everything. My coworkers are pretty cool, and my boss doesn't micromanage, so I can't complain. Anyway, I'd been dating Sarah for about 2 years at this point. Met her through a mutual friend at some house party, and we just clicked right away. She was funny, smart, worked in marketing at a different company. We moved in together after about 8 months, which felt right at the time. Everything seemed pretty normal, you know? We'd do the usual couple stuff, Netflix binges, trying new restaurants, weekend trips to her parents' place. Her family always seemed nice enough when I met them. Her parents were polite, maybe a little reserved, but I figured they just needed time to warm up to me. Sarah had this big extended family too, aunts, uncles, cousins who all lived in the area. They did these big family dinners pretty regularly, and I'd been to a few of them over the past year. So when I proposed 3 months ago, I thought everything was going great. Sarah said yes. We started planning the wedding, looking at venues, all that stuff. Her family seemed happy about the engagement, at least from what I could tell. That's why what happened at the dinner was such a shock. I mean, I knew I wasn't their first choice or anything, but I had no idea how they really felt about me until that night. The engagement dinner was supposed to be this nice celebration at Sarah's favorite Italian restaurant. Nothing too fancy, but the kind of place with white tablecloths and decent wine. Sarah had been planning it for weeks, making sure all her family could make it. I was actually looking forward to it because I thought it meant they were finally accepting me as part of the family. We got there around 7, and everyone was already seated at this long table they'd reserved. Sarah's parents, her sister Emma, a bunch of aunts and uncles, and some cousins I'd met before. The usual crew. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits, talking and laughing while we ordered appetizers and wine. I was sitting next to Sarah, trying to make conversation with her cousin Jake about his new job, when her uncle Richard stood up. Richard was this guy in his 50s, always wore expensive suits, and had this loud personality. He was the type who loved being the center of attention at family gatherings. He tapped his wine glass with his knife to get everyone's attention. I figured he was going to give some nice speech about Sarah and me, maybe welcome me to the family officially. Sarah grabbed my hand under the table, and I thought she was just excited. Richard cleared his throat and started talking about how happy he was that Sarah had found someone. So far, so good. Then he started talking about how important it was to find the right person, someone who could provide stability and security. I was nodding along, thinking this was pretty standard stuff. But then his tone shifted. He said something about how sometimes we need someone to fill a role temporarily, someone who can be there while we figure out what we really want. The table got a little quieter, but people were still smiling. I started feeling this weird knot in my stomach. Then he said it. He raised his glass and said he wanted to toast me for being such a good placeholder for Sarah, and that he hoped when the right person came along, I'd step aside gracefully. He actually used the word placeholder, like I was some kind of temporary solution. The whole table erupted in laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter either. Genuine, hearty laughter like he'd just told the funniest joke they'd ever heard. I felt my face get hot and looked around the table, expecting someone to tell him that wasn't appropriate or funny. But everyone was laughing and nodding like they completely agreed with him. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, to defend me, or at least look embarrassed by what her uncle had just said. But she was just sitting there with this weird smile on her face, not saying anything. She wasn't laughing, but she wasn't stopping it either. The toasting continued with other family members chiming in. Her aunt made some comment about how I was good practice for Sarah. Her cousin said something about me being a safe choice until something better came along. Each comment got more laughs, and I felt smaller and smaller. I tried to laugh along at first, thinking maybe if I played it off as a joke, it would stop. But it didn't stop. It kept going for what felt like forever, with different family members making comments about my temporary status in Sarah's life. The worst part was how comfortable they all seemed with this, like they'd been thinking these things for months and finally had permission to say them out loud. Sarah still hadn't said a word. She was just sitting there, occasionally taking a sip of wine, while her entire family basically told me I wasn't good enough for her. I kept waiting for her to speak up, to tell them they were being cruel, but nothing came. Finally, Richard sat back down, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But I couldn't focus on anything else. I felt completely humiliated and confused. These people had been nice to my face for 2 years, and now I was finding out what they really thought of me. After dinner, we all moved to the bar area of the restaurant. Sarah went to the bathroom, and I found myself standing alone near the hallway, trying to process what had just happened. I was still in shock, honestly. Part of me was wondering if I'd misunderstood something or if this was just their weird sense of humor. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to look busy, when I heard voices coming from around the corner. It was Sarah's cousins Jake and Melissa, and they were talking in these hushed tones that made me pay attention. Jake was saying something about how funny Richard's toast was, and Melissa agreed. But then their conversation took a turn that made my blood run cold. Melissa said she couldn't believe I hadn't figured it out yet, that Sarah had been pretty obvious about the whole thing. Jake asked what she meant, and Melissa explained that Sarah had been telling the family for months that I was just a temporary thing. She said Sarah was waiting for her ex-boyfriend David to come back from his job overseas, and that everyone knew I was just keeping her company until then. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to hear better without being seen. Melissa kept talking, saying that Sarah had shown her and Emma these text messages between her and David, where they were making plans for when he got back. She said Sarah had told them she was going to break up with me as soon as David was ready to get serious again. Jake seemed surprised by this and asked if Sarah actually loved me at all. Melissa laughed and said she doubted it, that Sarah had called me boring and predictable in their group chat just last week. She said the whole family thought it was hilarious that I was so clueless about everything. Then Jake said something that really got to me. He said he almost felt bad for me because I seemed like a decent guy, but that I was way too into Sarah for someone who was just a placeholder. Melissa agreed and said it was going to be brutal when Sarah finally dumped me. They started talking about David then, about how much better looking he was than me, how much more money he made, how Sarah had always been crazy about him. Melissa said Sarah had been counting down the days until his contract was up and he could move back. I felt sick listening to all this. Everything started making sense in the worst possible way. Sarah's recent distance, the way she'd been less affectionate lately, how she always seemed distracted when we talked about wedding plans. I'd noticed these things but convinced myself it was just pre-wedding stress. The cousins started walking back toward the main area, still talking and laughing about the situation. I waited until they were gone before coming out from behind the corner. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I might throw up. When I got back to the group, Sarah was there talking to her sister Emma. She smiled at me when she saw me, this normal, casual smile like nothing had happened. Like her uncle hadn't just humiliated me in front of everyone, and like her cousins weren't just discussing how temporary I was. I tried to act normal for the rest of the evening, but I felt like I was watching everything from outside my own body. Every laugh, every casual conversation, every moment felt fake now that I knew what was really going on. Sarah kept checking her phone throughout the night, and now I wondered if she was texting David. When we finally left the restaurant, Sarah was quiet in the car. I asked her if everything was okay, and she said she was just tired. I asked her about her uncle's toast, trying to give her a chance to explain or apologize. She just shrugged and said Richard always made inappropriate jokes, and that I shouldn't take it seriously. But I couldn't stop thinking about what her cousins had said. If they were right, then everything about our relationship was a lie. We got back to our apartment around midnight. Sarah went straight to the bedroom to change and get ready for bed, acting like it had been just another normal evening. I told her I was going to stay up for a while and watch TV, but really I just needed time to think about everything I'd heard. I sat on the couch in our living room, staring at the blank TV screen, trying to make sense of the night. Part of me wanted to believe that her cousins were wrong, that maybe they'd misunderstood something Sarah had said. But the more I thought about it, the more things started clicking into place. Sarah's laptop was sitting on the coffee table where she'd left it earlier. She always left it logged in because she said she trusted me, which had seemed sweet at the time. Now I wondered if she'd been more careful about hiding things on her phone. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Melissa had said about text messages and group chats. I'd never been the type to snoop through Sarah's stuff, but after what happened tonight, I felt like I needed to know the truth. I opened her laptop and went to her messages. At first, I just saw normal stuff, conversations with friends about work, messages with her mom about wedding planning, nothing suspicious. But then I saw a group chat called with Emma and a few of her cousins, including Melissa. My heart was pounding as I scrolled up to see older messages. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were months of messages about me, and none of them were good. Sarah had been calling me boring, saying I was too clingy, complaining about how I always wanted to talk about our future together. But the worst part was the messages about David. Sarah had been in constant contact with him while he was overseas. She'd been sending him photos, telling him she missed him, talking about their plans for when he got back. There were messages from just last week where she told Emma that David's contract was ending soon and she needed to figure out how to break up with me. I found one message thread that made me feel sick. Sarah had written to Emma about how guilty she felt sometimes, but that David was the love of her life, and she couldn't let him go. Emma had responded that I seemed really happy, and it would be cruel to string me along much longer. Sarah's response was that she'd end things after David got back, and they figured out their living situation. There were messages making fun of the engagement ring I'd bought her, calling it small and cheap compared to what David would probably get her someday. Messages about how I was a safe backup plan, but not marriage material. Messages about how the family thought it was funny that I was so serious about someone who was just killing time. I kept scrolling, finding more and more evidence of how little I meant to her. There were messages about how she'd been avoiding intimacy with me because she didn't want to feel more guilty about David. Messages about how she'd been sabotaging our wedding planning by being indecisive, hoping to buy time until David returned. The group chat went back almost a year, and the messages showed that her entire family had known about David the whole time. They'd all been in on this joke, where I was the clueless boyfriend who didn't know he was just a placeholder. Richard's toast tonight wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of months of them all thinking this was hilarious. I found messages from tonight, sent during dinner. Sarah had texted the group saying that Richard's toast was perfect and that maybe now I'd get the hint and make things easier for everyone. Emma had responded with laughing emojis, saying I looked so confused and pathetic. I sat there staring at the screen for I don't know how long. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship was a lie. Every time Sarah had said she loved me, every conversation about our future, every moment I thought we were building something together, it was all fake. The bedroom door opened, and Sarah came out in her pajamas. She saw me sitting with her laptop and asked what I was doing. I closed it quickly and said I was just checking my email. She looked at me strangely but didn't ask any more questions. She asked if I was coming to bed, and I said I'd be there in a few minutes. After she went back to the bedroom, I sat there trying to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. I felt angry and hurt and humiliated, but also strangely relieved to finally know the truth. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about everything I'd read, and every time I looked at Sarah sleeping next to me, I felt sick. She looked so peaceful, like she didn't have a care in the world, while I was lying there knowing our entire relationship was a sham. The next morning, Sarah got up and went through her normal routine like nothing had happened. She made coffee, checked her phone, asked me what I wanted for breakfast. I watched her acting so normal and casual, and I couldn't believe how good she was at pretending. I decided I had to confront her about what I'd found. I couldn't just pretend I didn't know and wait for her to dump me when David got back. I needed to hear her admit what she'd been doing. After she finished getting ready for work, I told her we needed to talk. She looked at me with this concerned expression and asked if everything was okay. I said I'd found her messages last night and that I knew about David. Her face went completely white. For a few seconds, she just stared at me without saying anything. Then she started asking what messages I was talking about, trying to play dumb. I told her I'd seen the group chat with her sister and cousins, and that I knew she'd been planning to leave me for her ex-boyfriend. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed and put her head in her hands. I thought she was going to confess everything and apologize, but instead she got defensive. She said I had no right to go through her private messages, and that I'd violated her trust by snooping. I couldn't believe she was trying to make this about my behavior. I told her that her family had humiliated me at dinner, and that I'd only looked at her messages because I needed to understand what was going on. She said her family was just joking around, and that I was being too sensitive about everything. Then she tried to minimize the David situation. She said they were just friends now, and that the messages didn't mean anything. She claimed she'd never actually planned to leave me, and that I was misinterpreting what I'd read. She said sometimes she just needed to vent to her sister about relationship stuff, and that everyone complains about their partners sometimes. But I'd seen too much to believe her explanations. I told her about the specific messages I'd read, about her calling me boring and temporary, about her plans with David. Each time I brought up something specific, she had some excuse or explanation that didn't really make sense. She started crying then, saying that she did love me and that she was sorry if some of her messages had been hurtful. She said she'd been confused lately about what she wanted, but that she'd chosen to be with me and that should count for something. She begged me not to throw away our relationship over some stupid messages. I wanted to believe her, honestly. It would have been so much easier to accept her apologies and try to move forward. But I kept thinking about her uncle's toast and how she just sat there while her family laughed at me. I thought about months of messages calling me a placeholder and making fun of our engagement. I told her I needed some time to think about everything. She asked if I was going to break up with her, and I said I didn't know yet. She started crying harder then, saying she couldn't lose me and that she'd do anything to make this right. But even as she was crying and apologizing, I noticed she never actually admitted to what she'd done. She never said she was wrong to string me along or that she was sorry for letting her family humiliate me. Everything was about how I'd misunderstood or how she'd been confused, never about how she'd deliberately deceived me. I told her I was going to stay at my friend Mike's place for a few days while I figured things out. She begged me not to go, but I couldn't stand being in the same apartment with her right then. Mike had been my best friend since college, and he was one of the few people who'd always been honest with me about Sarah. Not in a mean way, but he'd mentioned a few times that he thought she seemed distant or that maybe we weren't as compatible as I thought. I'd always defended her, but now I was wondering if he'd seen things I'd missed. I showed up at his place that afternoon with a bag of clothes and told him everything that had happened. Mike listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, he just shook his head and said he wasn't surprised. He said he'd always gotten the feeling that Sarah wasn't as invested in our relationship as I was. Mike let me crash on his couch and spend the next few days processing everything. He didn't try to tell me what to do, but he did help me think through my options. Part of me still wanted to try to work things out with Sarah, but Mike pointed out that even if she was sorry now, I'd never be able to trust her again. Sarah kept calling and texting me, alternating between apologies and accusations. Sometimes she'd say she was sorry and that she wanted to fix things. Other times she'd say I was overreacting and that I'd ruined everything by snooping. The mixed messages just confirmed that she still didn't really get what she'd done wrong. After a few days at Mike's, I started feeling angry instead of just hurt. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how calculated everything had been. Sarah hadn't just been confused or made some mistakes. She'd deliberately kept me around as a backup plan while pursuing someone else. Mike suggested that maybe I should confront her family about what they'd done. He said they'd all been in on humiliating me, and that they should face some consequences for that. At first, I didn't want to cause more drama, but then I started thinking about how they'd all laughed at me that night. I remembered that Sarah's family had another dinner planned for the following weekend. It was her grandmother's birthday, and I'd been invited before everything happened. Sarah had texted me asking if I was still coming, probably hoping we could pretend everything was normal. Mike encouraged me to go to the dinner and tell them exactly what I thought of their behavior. He said they'd gotten away with treating me like garbage for too long, and that maybe it was time someone called them out on it. He offered to help me prepare what I wanted to say. I spent the rest of the week thinking about whether I had the courage to actually confront Sarah's family. Part of me just wanted to disappear and avoid all the drama. But another part of me was tired of being treated like I didn't matter, tired of being the joke that everyone laughed about behind my back. I decided I was going to go to the birthday dinner, not to try to win Sarah back or to fix our relationship, but to make sure her family knew that I wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. I was going to tell them exactly what I thought of their behavior, and then I was going to walk away with whatever dignity I had left. Mike helped me practice what I wanted to say. He reminded me to stay calm and stick to the facts, not to let them derail me with interruptions or excuses. He said the most important thing was that I stood up for myself, regardless of how they reacted. The birthday dinner was at the same Italian restaurant where they'd humiliated me the week before. I almost turned around and left when I saw the familiar dining room, but I forced myself to walk in. Sarah's whole family was there again, sitting around the same long table. Sarah looked shocked when she saw me. She'd probably told everyone I wouldn't be coming. I could see her whispering urgently to her sister Emma as I approached the table. The conversations around the table got quieter as people noticed me. Her uncle Richard, the same guy who'd given the toast the week before, stood up and greeted me with this fake friendly voice. He said he was glad I could make it and asked how I was doing. I could tell he was trying to act like nothing had happened, probably hoping I'd forgotten about his placeholder comment. I sat down next to Sarah, who kept trying to catch my eye and figure out why I was there. Her parents made polite conversation, asking about work and acting like everything was normal. But I could feel the tension around the table, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. We got through ordering, and the first course with mostly normal conversation. Sarah's grandmother opened her presents, and everyone sang happy birthday. I played along with the pleasantries, but I was just waiting for the right moment. Then Richard stood up again, saying he wanted to make another toast. This time it was supposed to be about the grandmother, but I could see him glancing at me with this smirk, like he was planning to make another joke at my expense. Before he could start talking, I stood up too. I said I had something I wanted to share with everyone first. The table went quiet, and I could see Sarah looking panicked next to me. I pulled out my phone, where I'd saved screenshots of some of the group chat messages I'd found. I told the table that I wanted to read them something interesting I'd discovered about how this family really felt about me. Sarah immediately started trying to stop me, saying this wasn't the time or place. Her parents looked confused, and Richard told me to sit down. But I ignored all of them and started reading directly from the messages. I read the message where Sarah called me boring and predictable. I read the one where she said I was just a placeholder until David came back. I read Emma's response about how pathetic I looked at dinner the week before. With each message I read, the table got quieter and more uncomfortable. Sarah was crying and begging me to stop, but I kept going. I read the messages about how the whole family thought it was funny that I was so clueless. I read the ones about David being the love of Sarah's life and how she was counting down the days until his return. By the time I finished reading, the entire restaurant was staring at our table. Sarah's family looked mortified, not because of what they'd done, but because they'd been exposed in public. The grandmother looked confused and upset, probably not understanding what was happening. Richard tried to salvage the situation by saying I was obviously having some kind of breakdown and that I should leave. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more thing I wanted them to hear. I told the table that I had one more message to share with them, the one that had hurt the most. I found the screenshot where Sarah had written to Emma about how guilty she felt sometimes, but that she couldn't give up David because he was her soulmate. The message where she'd said I was good practice, but not marriage material. As I read that message aloud, I watched Sarah's face crumble. She wasn't just crying anymore. She was sobbing, probably realizing that there was no way to explain away what I'd just shared. Her parents looked shocked and disappointed, finally understanding what their daughter had been doing. But instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, Sarah's family went on the attack. Her aunt said I was being cruel and vindictive, that I had no right to air their private business in public. Richard said I was obviously unstable and that Sarah was better off without me. Emma stood up and said I was a psychopath for going through Sarah's messages and that everything I'd read was taken out of context. She claimed that Sarah really did love me and that I was destroying her life by being so dramatic about everything. I let them yell at me for a few minutes, watching as they tried to make me the villain in the situation. It was actually kind of amazing to see how quickly they shifted from being caught red-handed to attacking me for exposing them. Then I pulled out my phone again and told them I had one final thing to share. This time it wasn't a screenshot. It was a voice recording I'd made of Sarah's cousins talking in the hallway the week before. I'd recorded it on my phone when I realized what they were saying. I played the recording where Jake and Melissa discussed how Sarah was just waiting for David to come back, how she'd been telling the family for months that I was temporary, how they all thought it was hilarious that I was so clueless. Their own voices, clear as day, talking about what a joke I was to all of them. The table went completely silent when they heard their own family members' voices confirming everything I'd been saying. There was no way to deny it or claim I'd misunderstood anything when they could hear Jake and Melissa laughing about the situation in their own words. Sarah's parents looked absolutely mortified. Her father told Richard and the others that their behavior was unacceptable, that they'd treated me terribly. Her mother was staring at Sarah with this look of disappointment and disgust. But Sarah herself just kept crying and saying that none of this was supposed to happen, that David wasn't even coming back anymore anyway. She said she'd chosen me, and that should be enough, that I was ruining everything by bringing up old messages and conversations. I looked around the table at all these people who'd been laughing at me behind my back for months, who treated me like I was some kind of charity case they were humoring. I realized I didn't want their apologies or explanations anymore. I stood up and told them that I was done being their entertainment. I said they were all terrible people who'd shown me exactly what they thought of me, and that I was grateful to finally see them clearly. After I finished speaking, the restaurant was dead quiet except for Sarah's crying. Other diners were staring at our table, probably trying to figure out what kind of family drama they'd just witnessed. I felt exposed and raw, but also strangely relieved that I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in. Sarah's father was the first one to speak. He said he was ashamed of his family's behavior and that they owed me a sincere apology. He looked directly at Richard and told him that his toast the week before was cruel and unacceptable. But Richard just sat there with his arms crossed, looking angry that he'd been called out. Sarah's mother tried to say something about how families sometimes make mistakes, but that they all cared about me. I could tell she was trying to smooth things over, but it was too little too late. The damage was done, and we all knew it. Emma kept insisting that I was overreacting, that Sarah really did love me despite what the messages said. She claimed that everyone vents about their relationships sometimes, and that I was being unfair by taking private conversations out of context. But her excuses sounded hollow after everyone had heard the recording of her cousins. Sarah herself wasn't even trying to defend what she'd done anymore. She was just crying and saying over and over that she was sorry, that she never meant for things to go this far. She kept reaching for my hand, but I pulled away every time. The grandmother, who'd been quiet through most of this, finally spoke up. She said she didn't understand what was happening, but that it was clear everyone had behaved badly. She looked at Sarah and said she was disappointed that her granddaughter would treat someone so dishonestly. That seemed to break something in Sarah. She stood up suddenly and screamed that everyone was ganging up on her, that I'd ruined her grandmother's birthday by being vindictive and cruel. She said I was a psychopath who couldn't handle being dumped like a normal person. The irony of her calling me vindictive wasn't lost on me. This was the same person who'd been lying to me for months while planning to leave me for someone else. The same person who'd sat silently while her family humiliated me at dinner. Sarah grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit, but not before turning back to yell that I destroyed any chance we had of working things out. She said I was going to regret this, that I'd thrown away the best thing that ever happened to me. I watched her leave and felt nothing. No sadness, no regret, no desire to chase after her and try to fix things. Just relief that it was finally over and I didn't have to pretend anymore. Her parents apologized again and offered to pay for my dinner, but I declined. I told them I appreciated their apology, but that the damage was done. I said I hoped they'd think twice before treating someone else the way their family had treated me. As I walked out of the restaurant, I could hear them still talking behind me, probably trying to figure out how to handle the aftermath of what had just happened. But I didn't look back. I was done with all of them. I drove back to Mike's place in a daze. Part of me couldn't believe I'd actually gone through with confronting them like that. I'd never been the type to make a scene or air dirty laundry in public, but something about their behavior had pushed me past my breaking point. Mike was waiting up when I got back, eager to hear how everything had gone. I told him the whole story, and he said he was proud of me for standing up for myself. He said most people would have just walked away quietly and let Sarah's family think they'd gotten away with their behavior. Over the next few days, I got a bunch of calls and texts from different family members. Sarah's parents called to apologize again and to say they hoped I'd reconsider ending things with their daughter. A few of her aunts and uncles reached out to say they were sorry for how I'd been treated. But notably, I didn't hear from Richard, Jake, Melissa, or Emma. The people who'd been the most cruel seemed to think they'd done nothing wrong. Sarah sent me a few texts alternating between apologies and anger, but I didn't respond to any of them. The hardest part was dealing with all the practical stuff. We'd been living together for over a year, so I had to figure out where to go and how to get my things. Sarah was staying with her sister, so at least I didn't have to see her when I went back to pack. Going through our apartment was surreal. All these photos of us together, wedding planning magazines, the engagement ring she'd left on the dresser. It felt like looking at someone else's life, like these were artifacts from a relationship that had never really existed. I found myself thinking about all the signs I'd missed or ignored. The way Sarah had been less affectionate lately, how she always seemed distracted when we talked about the future, how she'd been protective of her phone. I'd chalked it all up to wedding stress, but now I realized she'd been pulling away because she was planning to leave. Mike helped me move my stuff out, and we didn't talk much during the process. What was there to say? I'd been in love with someone who saw me as a temporary convenience, and her entire family had been in on the joke. It was humiliating and painful, but at least now I knew the truth. The weirdest part was how relieved I felt. Once the initial shock and hurt wore off, I realized I'd been feeling disconnected from Sarah for months without understanding why. Now I knew it was because she'd been emotionally checked out of our relationship while maintaining the facade. I started thinking about what I wanted to do next, where I wanted to live, how I wanted to rebuild my life. For the first time in months, I felt like I could make decisions based on what I actually wanted instead of trying to make someone else happy. Epilogue. That was about 6 months ago now. I ended up getting my own place, a small one-bedroom apartment closer to work. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I don't have to worry about anyone lying to me or planning to leave me for someone else. I heard through mutual friends that David never actually came back from overseas, and that Sarah had been devastated when he told her he was staying there permanently. Apparently, she burned her bridges with me for nothing. I probably should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sorry for her. Sarah tried to reach out a few times in the months after everything happened, saying she'd made a mistake and wanted to try again. But I was done. Even if David hadn't been in the picture, I could never trust someone who deceived me so thoroughly and let her family treat me like garbage. I'm dating someone new now, actually. Her name is Rachel, and she's nothing like Sarah. She's direct and honest, sometimes to a fault. When she has a problem with something, she tells me about it instead of complaining to her friends behind my back. It's refreshing to be with someone who actually wants to be with me. The whole experience taught me a lot about self-respect and not settling for people who don't value you. I wasted 2 years of my life with someone who saw me as a placeholder, but at least I learned what real partnership should look like. I'm grateful that I found out the truth when I did, rather than after we'd gotten married and I was even more invested. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never overheard those cousins talking or looked at Sarah's messages. Would she have actually gone through with the wedding, or would she have found some excuse to call it off? I guess I'll never know, and honestly, I don't want to. I'm in a much better place now, with people who actually care about me and treat me with respect. That's worth more than any relationship built on lies and false promises.